The fever came first, a heat inside the skull that no cold water could touch. Then the eyes, red, inflamed, burning as if coals had been pressed into the sockets. The tongue turned crimson. Breath became foul, and then came the thirst, an unquenchable, maddening thirst that drove men to throw themselves into cisterns just to feel water against their blistering skin. Within 7 days, the body would betray itself completely. Pustules erupting across summer of 430. BC, 100,000 people would die. 1/3 of the population, gone. Among them, Pericles himself, the father of democracy, the architect of the Golden Age, the man who built the Parthenon. Bodies piled in temples. Law collapsed. Citizens who once debated philosophy in the agora now murdered each other for bread. Could the world's first democracy survive? This is the plague that killed Athens' Golden Age, shifted power to Sparta, and left a wound in Western civilization that never fully healed. To understand why Athens became a death trap, you must first understand what made it glorious. In 430 BC, Athens wasn't simply a city, it was an experiment, the most radical political experiment in human history. For the first time, citizens governed themselves. Not kings, not priests, not warlords. Ordinary men debating in public, voting on war and peace, building monuments that would define beauty for millennia. But this glory rested on 5 pillars, and each pillar carried the seeds of catastrophe. The first pillar, democracy itself. 40,000 citizens gathering to vote, debate, argue. The agora packed daily with bodies pressing against bodies. Democracy required crowds. Crowds require contact. Contact spreads disease. The second pillar, the long walls. 2 parallel fortifications stretching 4 miles from Athens to the port of Piraeus. Pericles' masterwork. They meant Athens could never be starved by siege. The sea would always feed them, but walls that keep enemies out also keep populations in. The third pillar, imperial wealth. And the Delian League poured tribute into Athenian coffers. Silver from allied states funded the Parthenon, the fleet, the festivals. Athens had become the richest city in the Greek world. But wealth attracts ships. Ships from Egypt, from Persia, from Africa. Ships carrying grain and olive oil and silk. Ships carrying invisible passengers. The fourth pillar, and here the danger sharpens, Pericles' war strategy. The Spartans had invaded Attica, burning farms and olive groves. Pericles refused pitched battle. His plan was elegant on papyrus: abandon the countryside, retreat behind the walls, let the navy win the war. What he didn't calculate was this: every farmer, every shepherd, every village family fleeing Spartan spears would crowd into Athens. The population doubled in weeks. The fifth pillar, the fatal flaw Athens could never see. And they believed their walls made them invincible. They believed their democracy made them blessed. They believed the gods favored them above all others. Pride. Hubris. The Greek word for the arrogance that comes before divine punishment. Every pillar was in place. The powder keg was loaded. Imagine standing in the Athenian agora on a spring morning in 430 BC. The smell hits you first: roasting meat from the food stalls, sharp olive oil, sweat from 1,000 bodies already conducting the business of empire. The sound is a roar. Merchants hawking pottery from Corinth, fishmongers shouting prices, philosophers surrounded by students arguing about justice, virtue, the nature of the soul. Politicians rehearsing speeches that will send triremes to war. The agora stretched across 12 acres. Colonnaded stoas lined its edges, and offering shade where citizens debated laws that would echo through centuries. Here, a potter might argue politics with an aristocrat. Here, a jury of 500 ordinary men could condemn a general to death. Here, democracy breathed. In the shadow of the Acropolis, you would see the Parthenon rising, still fresh, its marble not yet weathered, its painted sculptures blazing in reds and blues that tourists today would never believe. Athena's gold and ivory statue glittered inside, 40 feet tall, worth more than most cities. Tourists step over scattered column drums. The roar of democracy has been silent for 2,000 years. But in 430 BC, standing in that crush of humanity, you would feel invincible. What you would not feel is danger. What you could not know is that every handshake, every shared wine cup, every breath in that crowded space was a roll of dice. The invisible enemy was already coming. Now follow the refugees. The same land for generations abandoned their homes. They drove livestock through the gates. They carried children and cooking pots and whatever they could salvage. They expected to return in weeks. They never did. Inside the long walls, Athens transformed into something it was never designed to be. Every temple porch became a campsite. Every alley filled with makeshift shelters. Families who had known open fields now slept in spaces no larger than a grave. The numbers are staggering. Athens proper held perhaps 100,000 people before the war. After evacuation, estimates suggest 300,000 or more crammed into the urban corridor between Athens and Piraeus. Triple the population. The same wells, the same latrines, the same air. Heat rose from packed bodies. Human waste accumulated faster than it could be removed. The stench would have been overwhelming. Urine, rotting garbage, animal dung, the sour smell of too many people with too little water for washing. And still, the ships came. Piraeus harbor never stopped. Grain ships from Egypt, timber from Thrace, luxury goods from across the Mediterranean, each vessel bringing sailors who had touched a dozen ports, each port connected to 1,000 others. Somewhere in that web of trade, historians suspect Ethiopia, possibly Egypt, something stirred. Something that would travel in human bodies across Libya, through the Persian Empire, into the holds of merchant vessels. The plague didn't march. It sailed. The first cases appeared in Piraeus. Summer, the war's second year, a dock worker perhaps. A sailor who had felt fine when he boarded. A merchant inspecting grain shipments. We will never know the name of patient zero. Thucydides doesn't record it. The disease moved too fast for anyone to trace its origin. The initial symptoms seemed ordinary. Fever, headache. Surely just the summer heat. Surely just exhaustion. The afflicted went home to crowded quarters. They shared food with family. They breathed the same air as neighbors sleeping inches away. By the time the first pustules appeared, it was already too late. The disease did not spread from house to house. It exploded, and in the refugee camps along the long walls, where thousands slept in open air with no separation, the plague found paradise. One infected person could touch dozens daily. Those dozens touched hundreds. The mathematics of contagion became apocalyptic. Within weeks, bodies were appearing faster than they could be burned. Pericles' strategy, the walls, the evacuation, the crowding, had been designed to defeat Sparta. Instead, it created the perfect incubator for mass death. The fortifications meant to protect Athens became the walls of a trap. The refugees meant to outlast siege became kindling for plague. There was no escape. The Spartans waited outside. Death waited inside. This was the moment it became inevitable. The Golden Age had met its executioner. Thucydides watched it happen. He caught the plague himself, and felt his own body begin to betray him, and somehow survived. What he recorded is the first clinical description of epidemic disease in human history. His words are surgical, unflinching, horrifying. The sickness began in the head. Violent heat, eyes inflamed and blood red, throat and tongue turning crimson, emitting breath that was foul and unnatural. Then came sneezing, then hoarseness, then the cough that drove the disease downward into the chest. When it reached the stomach, the vomiting began. bile in every color the physicians had named, retching so violent it produced convulsions. The skin became reddish, livid, breaking out in small pustules and ulcers. Inside, the body burned with such fever that patients could not bear even the lightest linen touch. Many threw themselves into cisterns, driven mad by thirst that no amount of water could quench. Those who survived the first 7 days faced worse. The disease moved into the bowels, uncontrollable diarrhea, weakness so profound that many died simply from exhaustion. And for those who somehow endured even this, the extremities began to die. Fingers blackened, toes rotted, genitals, eyes, the body consuming itself piece by piece. Some survivors lost their memory entirely. They woke not knowing their own names, unable to recognize the faces of family members who had nursed them through the nightmare. There was no treatment. Physicians died faster than anyone. Their constant exposure guaranteed infection. Strong constitutions offered no protection. The healthy and the weak fell alike. Prayer accomplished nothing. The temples filled with suppliants begging the gods for mercy. The gods did not answer. The collapse came in waves. First, individual bonds shattered. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades refused to enter each other's homes. The simple act of caring for the sick became suicide. Those who showed courage and compassion died. Those who showed cowardice survived. The lesson was brutal and immediate. Then families disintegrated. Thucydides records it plainly. Exhaustion and terror broke the most sacred obligations. Parents abandoned children. Children fled from dying parents. Bodies lay unburied in homes because no relative would risk collecting them. The funeral rites that Greeks considered essential for the soul's passage to the afterlife, abandoned. Corpses rotted in houses until the smell became unbearable, then were dragged into streets and left. The temples became morgues. Sacred precincts where Athenians had worshipped for generations now overflowed with the dying and the dead. Bodies piled on altars, corpses stacked in sanctuary corners. The boundary between holy ground and charnel house dissolved. Then law collapsed. Thucydides writes the most chilling sentence in his entire history. Men did what they pleased. The fear of punishment vanished. Why obey laws when death was coming anyway? Why respect property when you might not live to enjoy it? Why honor debts, keep promises, maintain the countless small restraints that hold civilization together? The plague killed more than bodies. It killed the social contract. Citizens who had once prided themselves on democratic virtue now murdered for advantage. Theft became common. Violence erupted without consequence. The courts stopped functioning. And the assemblies still met, but what laws mattered when a third of the jurors would be dead within months? And finally, meaning itself died. The oracles had failed. Prayers went unanswered. The gods who supposedly protected Athens watched in silence as their temples filled with corpses. Some recalled an ancient prophecy about a Dorian war bringing pestilence. Others remembered it differently. The prophecy spoke of famine, not plague. They argued about the wording even as they died. Religious observance collapsed. Why sacrifice to gods who offered nothing? The traditional restraints of piety evaporated. Men spent freely, lived recklessly, pursued pleasure with desperate urgency. Life had become worthless, so they treated it as worthless. And then Pericles fell, the architect of everything, the long walls, the evacuation. But the strategy that had created this catastrophe watched his own sons die before him. The plague took them both. The man who had convinced Athens to crowd inside its walls now watched the walls become a mass grave. In 429 BC, Pericles himself developed symptoms. The fever, the thirst, the slow destruction. He lingered longer than most, but the outcome was certain. On his deathbed, friends gathered to list his achievements, the military victories, the buildings, the empire. Pericles interrupted them. His greatest achievement, he said, was this: no Athenian had ever put on mourning clothes because of him. It was no longer true. Tens of thousands wore mourning now. Because of him, because of his strategy, because of his walls. He died. Athens lost its steady hand, and what came after was worse. By 426 BC, the plague had burned itself out, and what remained was a husk. 100,000 dead. Some historians argue more. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. 1 of every 3 Athenians gone. The army that had dominated Greece lost a quarter of its fighting strength. The fleet that ruled the Aegean couldn't fully crew its triremes. The treasury that had built the Parthenon hemorrhaged silver on relief efforts that saved no one. Walk through Athens in 425 BC and you would find empty houses, workshops without craftsmen, farms without farmers, an entire generation erased. But the plague killed more than people. It killed judgment. Without Pericles, Athenian democracy lurched toward recklessness. New leaders rose, men like Cleon, aggressive, populist, unrestrained by the caution that Pericles had embodied. At the assembly that had once deliberated carefully, now swung between rage and panic. Decisions that shaped the fate of thousands were made in anger, reversed in fear, remade in spite. The Sicilian expedition proved the cost. In 415 BC, Athens launched a massive invasion of Syracuse, a gamble born from the overconfidence and desperation that plagued post-plague politics. 2 years later, the entire force was annihilated. 40,000 men. 200 ships, the greatest military disaster in Athenian history. Sparta smelled blood. By 404 BC, Athens surrendered. The long walls, Pericles' masterwork, the fortifications that had trapped a city with its own dead, were torn down to the sound of flute music. Spartan soldiers celebrated as the stones fell. Democracy itself nearly died. Sparta installed a puppet government. For the 30 tyrants ruled through terror, executing 1,500 citizens in 8 months. Athens eventually restored democracy, but the Golden Age was finished. The confidence was gone. The population never fully recovered. The empire evaporated. Yet something survived. Thucydides lived. He took his memories, his observations, his survivors' guilt, and transformed them into the first work of scientific history. His account of the plague remains studied by epidemiologists today. 24 centuries later, medical researchers still debate what disease he described. Typhoid fever, smallpox, Ebola, viral hemorrhagic fever. The symptoms match several candidates. None fit perfectly. The killer remains unidentified. But Thucydides gave us more than a medical mystery. He gave us a mirror. It was his description of social collapse. The abandonment of law, the death of piety, the disintegration of family bonds became a template. Every historian who documented subsequent plagues drew from his account. The Antonine Plague, the Black Death, the 1918 influenza. Each generation of scholars returned to Thucydides to understand how civilizations unravel, and Athens itself left a ghost that haunts us still. The Parthenon stands, damaged, looted, partially destroyed, but standing. The ideas born in the agora spread across centuries. Democracy, philosophy, theater, rational inquiry. The Romans borrowed them. The Renaissance rediscovered them. The American founders quoted them. The Golden Age lasted barely 50 years. Its influence has lasted 2.5 millennia. 4 years, 1 disease, 100,000 dead. The plague of Athens taught humanity a lesson we keep forgetting. The infrastructure we build for protection can become the architecture of death. The connections that make us wealthy make us vulnerable. The crowds that enable democracy also enable contagion. Pericles designed walls to save his city. The walls became a coffin. For centuries, this was ancient history, a distant catastrophe from a lost world, studied by classicists and forgotten by everyone else. But imagine today, a global trading network connecting every port on Earth. Cities of 10 million, 20 million, packed with humanity. An illness appearing in one province, then boarding an airplane. Leaders making choices, lockdowns, evacuations, crowding, with consequences they cannot foresee. Does that sound like 430 BC? Or does it feel uncomfortably familiar? And Thucydides wrote his history, he said, as a possession for all time. He believed human nature was constant. He believed the patterns would repeat. He believed future generations would face the same tests, make the same mistakes, suffer the same consequences. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the tests have a way of coming back. Which forgotten catastrophe should we uncover next? Let me know in the comments. I'm watching the past so we can understand the present. Together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.